Let's cringe in the Central Committee. Let's bog in the Central Committee right now.
This is called the alt-right playbook, The Death of a Euphemism.
Say, for the sake of argument, you're a liberal journalist in the year 2016 of the Common Era. Your beat is covering the Republican primaries. A lot of people are vying for the presidential nomination, and so it falls to you to attend and write up their debates. Part of your job is deciphering conservative euphemisms. When the subject of illegal immigration comes up, for instance, you'll have to explain to your audience that the idea of protecting American jobs from undocumented workers is Republican double talk for hating Mexicans. No one is tightening security at the US-Canada border, no one is pulling over white Europeans to check their visas, and undocumented workers contribute a massive amount to the economy while taxpayers don't have to cover Social Security, unemployment, or Medicare for them. Protecting jobs has always been used to paper over racism. So you're sitting there watching the debate, these factoids at the ready, when one of the candidates says he wants to tighten the borders because Mexico is sending us rapists and thieves. I'm sorry, what? What just happened? That is not a thing Republicans are supposed to say out loud. It's against the rules. You can't just cop to believing Mexicans are degenerates after decades of calling border security a jobs issue. Also, immigrants, legal or otherwise, aren't soldiers. Since when are they sent by anyone? By the time you pull yourself out of that thought spiral, the debate has shifted. Now they're talking about the war on terror, so you somewhat warily prepare to contextualize another set of euphemisms. This is a subject almost always used to mask Islamophobia. Whenever an act of domestic terror is committed by someone of Palestinian descent, politicians try to link it to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, where if the bomber or shooter is a white Christian, the terrorist is referred to as a lone wolf, not part of any pattern, despite there being significantly more white Christian lone wolves than Palestinian terrorists.
And by the way, that's been true for a long time. This video was made in 2018. And what was the threat to our democracy? Was it foreign actors? Was it Muslim extremists? No, it was white Christians after they lost. And that's the way it is.
This war on terror never seems to expand beyond regions with oil deposits. But then that same candidate pipes up and says if elected for the sake of security, he wants to create a Muslim registry, and what the hell is going on? Politicians just don't talk like this. Conventional wisdom is that this kind of language will flare up the extremists in your party while alienating your base. And appealing to both at the same time is why we invented euphemisms. And sure enough, in the following months, you have far-right pundits talking about a Muslim ban on national television, waxing nostalgic about the Japanese internment camps of the 1940s like they weren't a national disgrace. You've got that same candidate casting aspersions on the judge investigating him for fraud because the judge is Mexican-American. You're sitting there with your pen ready to write an article about the alienation of the moderate Republican base, but that moment never seems to come. The guy seemingly tanking his candidacy by appealing to extremists is the one who finally secures the nomination. You realize with some shock that in each of these cases you are witnessing the death of a euphemism. The death of a euphemism is a rare celestial event. Politicians only let a euphemism die when they don't need it anymore. This does not imply good things for Mexicans or Muslims. The circumstances under which a euphemism may die are often spelled out in the circumstances under which it is born. So if we want to discuss it, we'll have to start at the beginning. Let's talk about euphemistic racism in the Republican Party. In the year 1964, there was a man. We'll call him Barry, Silver Milk. Silver Milk was the Republican nominee for president, and for various reasons, he was almost certainly going to lose the election. The Democrats were the incumbent party, they'd pretty much controlled Congress since the 40s, and the country was still in mourning after the devastating assassination of a Democratic president. The United States wasn't looking to change parties. About the only thing Silver Milk had going for him was that the Democrats had just signed into law the Civil Rights Act, expanding the voting rights of black citizens and desegregating a lot of American life. And a lot of white voters were pissed about it. In those days, you couldn't really claim
By the way,
Republicans
Chad,
or...
look at the signs that people used to protest. Communist Jews behind race mixing. Closed mixed school. This was what conservative opposition to the Civil Rights Acts looked like.
about it. In those days, you couldn't really claim Republicans or Democrats were good on race, and black people, when they were allowed to vote at all, were much more evenly split between parties than they are today. However, a Democrat pushing through the Civil Rights Act had, intentionally or otherwise, made race a partisan issue. The upshot, Silvermilk realized, was that disgruntled white people might be willing to abandon the Democratic Party if given the right incentive. In '64, Republicans didn't have much of a coalition, not since Democratic tax policies had dragged America out of the Great Depression, and incidentally created the greatest period of economic growth and prosperity in the history of the industrialized world, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. If Silvermilk could siphon white voters out of the Democratic Party, he might bring a strength to Republicans that they hadn't seen in decades. But to do that, he'd have to run his campaign on a pro-segregation platform. Now, white racists have a complicated relationship to their own racism. They seemingly want the impossible. They want segregation without appearing to be segregationists, racist policy without the social repercussions. Possibly, they don't even want to admit their racism to themselves. So Silvermilk would need a framing that allowed the blithely racist, the overtly racist, and the non-racist to unite under a single banner. For this purpose, Silvermilk landed on the long-enduring euphemism, states' rights. Now, obviously, the states' rights argument didn't originate in 1964. It's very old, and in fact used to be more of a Democrat thing. We're talking about the specific invocation of states' rights as a defense of inequality. Silvermilk argued that desegregation, though certainly a nice idea, shouldn't be enacted at the federal level, because no matter how acute the plight of black Americans, the decision to desegregate should be left to the states. Of course, anyone embracing this rhetoric knew full well that many states would never in this lifetime desegregate unless forced to. But you see, that's not the aim, merely the side effect. In this framing, no one is officially pro-segregation, they're simply anti-desegregation. This brokered a compromise between the reactionaries and the centrists in the United States. It allowed moderate Republicans some deniability about what direction their party was headed, and it allowed the Silvermilk campaign to secure the votes of white racists without having to publicly embrace them. Now, in spite of all of this, Silvermilk, as predicted, lost the election in a landslide. But it would be wrong to take that as a rejection of what
The worst landslide in American history.
he tried.
By popular vote.
This was the beginning of the modern Republican Party. This is where the Deep South, formerly a lock for the Democrats, first voted for the party of Lincoln. This is where white flight from the Democratic Party began, and why today we see white people, particularly white men, are the only demographic that consistently votes Republican. Silvermilk's rhetoric was foundational to bringing Republicans back to power in the 80s, finally breaking the Democrats' hold over the House of Representatives. Some will argue that Silvermilk did sincerely believe in states' rights, and that rebuilding the Republican Party by appealing to white racists was not his intent. And if you believe that, perhaps I can interest you in a very promising real estate venture in Florida. But regardless of what you believe about his intentions, that is how states' rights has been used, as a cudgel in service of bigotry. States' rights was invoked, and is still invoked, to defend anti-miscegenation laws, anti-abortion laws, same-sex marriage bans, trans bathroom bills, spousal rape, you name it.
So, and this is just the beginning. Criminalizing marijuana, felon disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, pretty much everything toxic in American politics is defended through the rubric of states' rights. Spousal rape, yes. According to conservatives believe that a husband cannot rape their wife. Conservatives, I'll say that again, conservatives believe that a husband cannot rape their wife.
Every time there are gains for social minorities, the Republicans shore up the votes of bigots who find these gains offensive. It's hard for the left to argue with the states' rights argument because it's not designed to make sense. Republicans will say we should leave an issue like same-sex marriage up to the states, but only after a federal ban on same-sex marriage proves infeasible. Up until that moment, they are in favor of government overreach. So states' rights...
In fact, on gay marriage in particular, George W. Bush was thinking about passing a constitutional amendment. Now, if you don't know this, if you're not somebody who went to law school, you may not know this, but traditionally, what's known as family law was left up to the states. You wouldn't interfere with what states said with dealing with custody and with consanguinity regulations of regarding marriage. This is something that, if there's any DGGers in the chat, you may not know this, that for most of the recent American history, cousin marriage was legal in about half the country. So DGGers, there's still hope for you. That some states, cousin marriages are what is known as void. Meaning, if you marry your cousin in Pennsylvania, it's not a marriage as a matter of law. You cannot form a cousin marriage in Pennsylvania. However, that's not true in all states. For example, if you're in Florida, you are allowed to marry, or Alabama, you are allowed to marry your cousin. And that is a real marriage. So this creates a little bit of a wrinkle.
Hard for the left to argue with the states' rights argument because it's not designed to make sense. Republicans will say we should leave an issue like same-sex marriage up to the states, but only after a federal ban on same-sex marriage proves infeasible. Up until that moment, they are in favor of government overreach. So states' rights has never been a consistent philosophy. But then why should it be?
Nebraska is the land of the free. I don't know. There's just something about Nebraskans really loving that incestual relationship. I don't know what it is. It's weird. I think it must be in the water there.
Euphemism. Its sole purpose is bringing an extreme ideology into mainstream politics. About the only blessing of a political euphemism is that the belief that can't be spoken is a belief that is, to some extent, contained. The states' rights argument makes bigotry more pervasive, but keeps it somewhat less draconian than the bigots might prefer. If you have to smuggle your marriage ban into a states' rights argument, you're painted into a corner should your state choose to legalize it. Then, if you want to keep the homophobic vote secure, you've got to find and popularize a different euphemism. Managing an alliance between moderates and reactionaries, especially when you can't acknowledge that one half of that alliance even exists, is a hard needle to thread, and depending on who's in charge of the party at a given time, the alliance can be tenuous. The far right is often viewed by their own party as the mad woman in the attic. We feed her, but we don't talk about her. Republican campaigners are somewhat known for going out and getting far-right folks registered to vote, and then talking shit about them when they're out of earshot. I suspect they enjoy standing next to extremists because it makes them look moderate by comparison. Though we should be clear, if you need to stand next to someone whose bumper sticker says, "If I had known this, I would have picked my own cotton to not look racist," your house is not in order.
So, chat, one thing, I forgot the second half of my point. So, if, for example, you got married in Alabama to your cousin, and you lived with your cousin wife, for years, and you had children, and they started following a Twitter account called Omniliberalism, you would, and you moved to, say, Pennsylvania. Well, in Pennsylvania, a cousin marriage is void. You can't have a cousin marriage. Well, now you have a family. Is Pennsylvania going to unilaterally overturn the Alabama legalized cousin marriage? What about all those DGG orphans? What are they going to do? Well, fortunately for DGG, Pennsylvania recognizes Alabama's right to allow cousin marriage. And so for the purposes of comity, is what it's called, COMITY, Pennsylvania will recognize your Alabama cousin marriage, even though it wouldn't be legal to do it in Pennsylvania. So that's where states' rights isn't even really an answer, because what if you legalized it with states' rights? So like gay marriage was legal in California, and then you move to Alabama, is gay marriage, are they going to void your marriage? What if you have kids that you've adopted? What if you have a family? What if you have biological children? Are they going to rip that family apart? So states' rights doesn't really actually tell you the answer about whether or not a thing is tolerated or not. right? And that was a problem that we had with slavery in the United States. Beyond the fact that it's a huge moral wrong and a crime against humanity, if slavery is banned in Pennsylvania, but it's legal in, say, Alabama, weird coincidence that, what if somebody who's a slave runs to Pennsylvania? Well, in Pennsylvania, slavery is illegal. Does that mean that the slave is now free because they ran to Pennsylvania? What about the guy from Alabama coming up to Pennsylvania with a slave? Are they free now? Can the slave run away? Are they free? Like, so that complication is, and what happened was slave owners in the South imposed their will upon the North through Dred Scott, through the Fugitive Slave Act. So even though the North didn't want to have slavery, it was imposed upon them. Their states' rights were subsumed because the national policy was to defend slavery. Does that make sense? So states' rights is a meaningless phrase. It doesn't mean anything. It's bullshit.
And the far right knows this. Say what you want about them. They're not all fools. Their party often doesn't respect them because it doesn't have to. Who the hell else are they gonna vote for? They are the necessary evil. But if what a person wants, what they actually want, is segregation, is a nationwide ban on same-sex marriage, is the mass deportation of Mexicans, is the closing of borders to all Muslim nations, this euphemistic states' rights, job security, war on terror, half-measure bullshit isn't going to cut it forever. When you court the vote of bigots, sooner or later, it's put up or shut up. I don't say this to generate sympathy for them. None of these are desires worth having, and no nation calling itself a democracy should ever represent them, not even as watered-down euphemisms. But to bring us back to the recent past, I say this because in 2016, it had been a long time since these people felt that any party had truly represented them. And this is why a candidate who doesn't say protecting jobs, he says Mexicans are rapists, who doesn't say war on terror, he says Muslim registry, appeals to them. He says, in so many words, the Islamophobes, the racists, the sexists, the segregationists, they are my base. I will not appeal to moderates and treat them as the necessary evil. I will speak to them directly, without euphemism, because honestly, I don't know how euphemisms work. These are my people, and they are the ones the Republican Party should embrace with open arms. This is supposed to be political suicide. And in the months that follow, it looks like maybe it will be. All the other journalists are writing this up as a fluke and an embarrassment. Him securing the nomination has doomed the Republican Party. The moderates will never elect him. Not only will he fail, he will lay bare the ugly truth about his entire party. He lags in the polls. Republican lawmakers disavow him. The Republican National Committee revokes their endorsement. Statisticians say not only will he lose in the swing states, but some Republican strongholds might vote Democrat for the first time in 40 years. They suspect he could drag Republicans in the House and Senate down with him. Democratic control of all three branches of government. His loss will be as sweeping as Silvermilk's in '64, and the ensuing Republican realignment will be as dramatic. But when the day comes, that's not the headline you have to write. How do you make sense of this? You're a political writer. You're supposed to tell people what this means. How do you even begin? Well, it means party loyalty is one of the strongest things in politics today. Come election day, people who disavowed him were making phone calls on his behalf. It means
Oh, Ted Cruz, man. Ted Cruz. You love to see it, chat. You love to see it.
We're making phone calls on his behalf. It means the Republican Party has drifted to the right far enough that the so-called moderates are more closely aligned with white nationalists than they are to the moderate left. It means, in all likelihood, the bigots are the base now, and the moderates the hangers-on. Politicians can be as racist as they want because who the hell else are Republicans gonna vote for? That's not the realignment you were expecting. Now, there's no saying how long this state of affairs will last. One election doesn't mean the center-right and the far-right know how to build a coalition. Maybe a year or two from now, when this guy's passed a little legislation, the moderates will have buyer's remorse, the extremists will feel their guy was more blunt talk than he was action, everything will be worse, and no one will be happy. But that's not much comfort, because it tells you almost nothing about how the next election will go. At this point, anything could happen. A euphemism dies when it no longer works to disguise things that can't be said, or when culture at large decides things that can't be said are now sayable. In the last couple videos, we've talked about how the far right mainstreams a, for instance, racist idea by convincing people it's not racist. What we're seeing here is the end game of that process. Once the public embraces them as people, elects their politicians, and implements their policies, they begin, bit by bit, to drop the pretense. Because if they want to close the borders once and for all, it's in their best interest to stop pretending border control is about protecting jobs. A sad truth about humans is they will often accept almost any justification to keep doing whatever they're already doing. If someone has spent years favoring border security, they've voted for it, their taxes have paid for it, maybe they've even called ICE on someone, and one day you tell them, keep doing what you're doing, but by the way, it's not about jobs anymore, now it's about keeping Mexicans out. A lot of them will roll with it. We like to think action follows belief, and sometimes it does, but at least as often it's the reverse. And that's a dangerous thing when given the choice to do something different.
My socialist agenda DSA rose.
Bofi, thank you for the tier 1.
Or do the same thing, only more. To the far right, a euphemism is like a calf. Something to be brought into this world or inherited, removed from its original context, raised to adolescence, and then slaughtered when the time is right. Historically, the first sign that things are about to get a lot worse for minorities is when the racism stops being euphemistic. In a sense, the far right and the liberal journalist share a purpose. The journalist's goal is to expose the truth behind the euphemism in the hopes that people will abandon bigotry once it's been made explicit. The far right does the same, hoping they won't.
And I love me some Innuendo Studios, chat. I love me some Innuendo Studios. Check them out. They're very good. Even their videos that are a few years old have just really held up so well. If you want more leftists on this platform and other platforms that actually go into deep dives about issues like finance and electoral politics, you're never gonna find a better stream than this one. Here's some things you can do. I'm posted YouTube content constantly. We had another Jimmy Dore video. We had a not safe for stream debate with conservatives where Vosh and I and Denims debated with a bunch of conservatives about voter fraud. You have the dumbass takes of uniting with fascists. Get in there. Get in there.